Hi, I'm Dr. Patricia Grabarek.
And I'm Dr. Katina Sawyer, and welcome to Thriving at Work, a Worker Being podcast.
You can learn more about us on our website, workerbeing.com, or on social media, or you can support our community. You can find more details on workerbeing.com/community. So today, we're going to be talking about a report that came out of the APA, the American Psychological Association, that basically gives a rundown or I'm trying to blank on the word, but an overview of the working world in the U.S. today. So it's kind of like a snapshot of how people are feeling about things in the U.S. From a work perspective. So I'm excited about it. I think it's going to be a good one.
That sounds awesome. I would really enjoy learning more about that. And I haven't seen this report, so that sounds like a really useful, practical thing to be bringing up.
Yes, it is. I hadn't seen it either. I literally was logging in to APA's website to look at different journal articles, and this was like on the homepage, and I was like, oh, this is super relevant. I think we're going to do this and not a peer-reviewed journal today, just because I thought it was relevant, interesting, and it just kind of gives a picture, a snapshot of where the world is, or where the U.S., at least the working world in the U.S. is today. So I thought it was important. But before we dive into it, I would love your perspective. What do you think is the biggest challenge facing the American workforce today?
Whoa, that's a really big question.
I know.
What do I think is the biggest challenge facing the American workforce? Well, I think that there are a couple of things. I guess like the broadest scope thing is that I feel like the amount of income inequality and the disgruntledness of people who realize that their jobs could be better and their pay could be better, and that people at the top of organizations are resource rich and in fact got like a lot wealthier in the pandemic. I think post-pandemic people are like a little more fed up with having to deal with that kind of thing. So I think that there could be some like murmurings of like, more worker revolutionary type things of people pushing for more accountability, responsibility at the top of organizations. Like I think there's just more transparency and awareness. And as people start to realize how those things are changing, I think that people are they're willing to put up with less from their employers, I think. And I think that's one thing that might end up being a big shift. But the other is also like a post-pandemic thing, which is I think like just this tension between virtual work and on-site work and how companies are going to grapple with people recognizing that they can do their jobs from home and companies wanting them to come back, and some people also wanting to come back and other people not wanting to come back. And the research that we know, there are a lot of pros to working from home. So I do think that's going to become another kind of big thing that people are going to have to reckon with in a really real way.
Yeah, I totally agree with you. And I actually think the two are very related because there's like a control component, right? It's like the people that have benefited and resource rich, as you said, at the top of organizations are also the people that like want to maintain that control. And I think that is where this return to office is not maybe consciously, but is somewhat coming from, right? It's like, well, now we're losing control of these employees. These employees are recognizing that we are no longer, maybe paying in an equitable fashion, or there's these big disparities, this big wage gap that's happening. And the more they're off on their own doing something, the more they can, quote, quiet quit, the more they have control, and we want the control. So I think there's like a control aspect underlying all of this. But I think you're so right, because like I'm even thinking about I'm in LA, so the writer strikes, SAG-AFTRA strikes, like huge strikes that are happening, and then like Bob Iger comes out and is like, well, what the actors want is unreasonable with his $27 million a year salary, like absurd, and it's not like. It's not like, Leonardo DiCaprio is being there like, I don't make enough money. It's more like the extras are not making any money, or people want, I don't know if you know this, but one of the big fights with SAG-AFTRA is they want to basically, if you're an extra or someone in the scene in a film, they want to be able to scan your image and then use it in different movies. So like if you're sitting at a restaurant and you're just like eating a meal in the background of a scene, they could scan you and then in like 3 movies use you, but you don't get paid for those 3 movies.
Oh, that's crazy.
Yeah. So it's like basically they own your likeness, but then that also hurts your chances to work for a different studio because now like let's say Sony owns that image of you in the restaurant. Well, now Disney can't scan you because Sony already owns you. So it's just
crazy.
like it's wild. So they're acting as if it's like these rich, wealthy actors that are really trying to be money hungry, but ultimately it's not about them at all.
Yeah.
It's really about all the other people that are in SAG-AFTRA that do not make millions of dollars that,
Right.
you know, maybe just want
Right.
to own their own likeness.
Yeah. That's
Yeah.
wild.
I know. I could go on forever about these things. I've been listening to it a lot. And again, like it impacts like Danny's work. It impacts a lot of people I know around me. So,
Yeah.
but I do think it kind of gets to what you were saying. Like here's like this is like one of the biggest strikes that Hollywood's ever seen. And I think there's more of this kind of stuff to come because of this disparity and then this like fight for control. And it's really interesting, but
Yeah. Yeah.
I think you're right. I agree with you.
Yeah, I mean, I think if there's one thing, and this was a very specific study on chief diversity officers, but we did it kind of pre and post pandemic. And one thing I can say is that they were just like, we're done. Like, we want to do our job on our own terms. And we're like sick of people telling us that they don't have budget for stuff and they don't have like, for how long are you going to say that this is not important enough to prioritize? Because that's what you're saying. You have the money, you're just not prioritizing it. So I think people are starting to get irritated the more they realize that like they're being told one thing, but that the reality of what's going on, or like, you know, we need to come back into the office because it's better for productivity. And people are like, is it really? Or like, is that just like what you're saying because you want us back, you know, like stuff like that. So, in any event, that's what I think. But I'm curious to hear what the report has to say because I'm guessing that they have a thought on this, maybe.
Yeah, so it's the question I asked was much broader. This survey was a little bit more narrow, so it's like Work in America survey is what they called it. And it's really, I mean, it's coming from the Psychological Association, right? So APA, American Psychological Association. So it's obviously focused on like psychological health, mental health, well-being. So it's not really getting, I mean, all of those things obviously impact mental health and well-being, for sure. But the way the questions in the survey were framed didn't really get fully at some of those issues. But the things that I'll just kind of go into the takeaways first, and that kind of gets to the main points, the main things that we can say definitively is happening in America around this topic. So number 1, 92% of workers say that it's important that their company values emotional, mental, and psychological well-being. So that's basically everybody, right?
Huge.
Yeah. Most people really care about that. And those are only people that agree. So like if anybody responded neutral, like that other 7% could be neutral and disagrees. So just keeping that in mind. Also, on top of that, so they care about it. The takeaway number 2 is that 55% of workers think that their employer thinks the workplace is healthier than it actually is. Which kind of gets to some of this, right?
Interesting.
That we've been talking about. And then my third key takeaway is that 57% of employees are experiencing symptoms that are associated with burnout.
Wow. Okay.
Huge
Well,
number.
that's a big problem that needs fixing. And it sounds like people, you know, it could be related that so many people think that it's important because if that many people are experiencing it themselves, then it makes sense that they have to at least know someone who's experiencing it for them to think it's important. So that's really interesting.
Yeah, I thought it was super interesting too. I mean, it's great that employees are really interested in this topic. I think that's something that organizations need to note right away, right? It's like a lot of people care about this. Most people care about this. Like 7% feels like almost like a rounding error, right? Like that's not really anybody. Those contrarians that don't want their company to care about their wellness. I don't know what's happening in their worlds, but I think most people can agree on that.
Totally.
And so this stat, I think, just is a great one to say, like, hey, company, like, everybody cares about this. So you need to care about this if you want your employees to stay with you, be engaged, you know, productive, etc. And then also if you want to attract anybody that is, you know, wanting to work in a place or that cares about these things.
Yeah.
So I think that's a huge, huge point for employers.
Yeah. Yeah. That sounds absolutely, this sounds like an extremely important report. So do you want to tell us a little bit about how they did it or some background on kind of how they got to these takeaways and maybe some more detail around that?
Yeah, I mean, well, the report is long, so I'm going to include a link because it's just like stat after stat after stat after stat.
Okay.
Like there's a ton of stats in
Full
here.
of stuff.
Yeah, which I obviously cannot go through all of that unless, I mean, that would be extremely boring. We don't want to do that. But it was run by it was run by Harris Online Polls. So just like, you know, any kind of other poll that you're really doing, but it's like obviously the survey questions I think were pretty strong that I looked at them. But it's a online poll and they used like all the things, Katina, that you would be familiar with to make sure that like the data is accurate and that we're not like seeing false questions or, you know, people clicking and responding, like agree to everything or whatever. And so they did that, and it was basically they were looking at employed adults. So you had to be over 18 and you had to be employed. And then they weighted the data based on a variety of things, right? So they looked at things like gender differences, age differences, race, marital status, household size, income, part-time, full-time, all that kind of stuff. So they looked at everything to see if there were any differences. So they asked all those questions, the demographics, and then they asked a bunch of different questions around workplace wellness, and that the way they were framing it was around like mental health, emotional health, psychological health. They talked about, they measured things like what are workplaces providing, which I'll talk about in a second. But ultimately, this survey was framed around the Surgeon General's 5 workplace essentials. So I don't know if we talked about that before on the podcast, have we?
I don't think so, no. So it would be good to maybe recap those.
Yeah. So I don't know if you've read them in detail, but basically, I think it was in October or November, the Surgeon General came out with a framework for workplace mental health and well-being. And it's basically like, here are the 5 essentials that you need in a workplace. And the 5 that they selected, which, you know, there were people like us involved in this, so it's not like it came out of nowhere. But the 5 they selected was protection from harm, which includes like security and feeling safe and toxic work environments, stuff like that. Connection and community. So that's like social support and belonging. Work-life harmony, which includes things like autonomy and flexibility. Mattering at work. So including things like meaning at work, stuff like that. And also they also included like dignity in that one, which is like people are treating you with respect and like a human. And then the last one is opportunity for growth, which is learning, just basically like, are you able to learn and accomplish things on the job? So those are the 5 that the Surgeon General identified as like the workplace essentials.
Cool.
And so then what they did is ask questions in all of these 5 areas, and there's like a ton of findings under those. So there's a lot in here to unpack.
Yeah, I mean, and those sound pretty core to what we know as IO psychologists are really important for comprehensively approaching well-being in life and in work. So I think those sound pretty solid. You know, sometimes we see stuff come out in various reports where we're like, I don't know, like, seems like maybe they were trying to push things in this direction or that direction. It's not really representative, but it feels like those 5 cover a lot of bases that we would say are really important.
Completely agree. Yeah. So I felt really good about it. And that's kind of what drew me to this report is like, you know, I know people have talked about the Surgeon General's framework and stuff about workplace well-being. And then now the APA is doing the survey. So like, it's not, you know, what we typically do in our podcast, right? Where we're talking about like this led to this and this predicts this or this causes that. It's more of just like an understanding of where people are today. And I think that's really important just so that we know, like, is this something we should be focusing on and caring about? And obviously we think it is. And now this report kind of supports that too.
Absolutely. Yeah. And we, think about, and the research we usually cover is about predictive analytics, right? It's about, trying to understand what leads to what, like you said. But sometimes descriptive data where it's saying this percentage of people feel this way or that percentage of people are experiencing this is also really helpful because you can get a huge sample of people to fill it out and really get a sense of like a pulse of the population in a way that's more challenging to do when you're doing surveys that take a really long time and you have to incentivize people heavily to do them. Sample sizes are smaller. So pros and cons of both. And it's good to have this on here as well.
Yeah, exactly. So this is a big sample. You've got like that kind of overview, that picture, and then that can inform what you want to do from like a predictive perspective, right? So just to kind of dig in deeper, the other stat I had mentioned was that 55% of workers think that their employer doesn't know how mentally healthy the workplace is, right? They think it's better than it actually is. And then 43% actually said that if they had a mental health condition, they were worried that it would have a bad impact on them, that they would go into the workplace and have some sort of consequence of that. So overall, that's a really big percentage of the population that's sitting there thinking like, oh, I can't speak up if I have a mental health challenge or my company doesn't get it. Like they think we're okay, but we're actually struggling.
Okay. Yep.
Yeah. So that's unfortunate.
Yeah. So people are really reporting that they feel like their company is kind of missing the mark.
Exactly.
Okay.
Yeah. And then like kind of from there, that led to them talking about some of the stress impacts. And so 77% of workers reported having some sort of work-related stress in the last month. And then 57% had some of those symptoms that I mentioned that are related to burnout. So things like exhaustion, things like, feeling ineffective, stuff like that.
Okay, gotcha. So I guess what it's painting is that employees are recognizing that there's an issue. They're reporting that there's an issue, but they also are not feeling as if their companies are being supportive in the way that they should be.
Exactly. Yeah. And they actually had some quotes, which I thought was super interesting to have quotes in this type of a survey. So they had a quote from an employee. It says, one male full-time employee from the South described the problem with his workplace as follows. So he said, workload, not having enough employees, and working long hours have a negative impact on my overall mental health, happiness, and well-being. So clear, that's like representative of kind of like what people are thinking, which is why they included that quote.
Yeah.
And it kind of leads to like the reality of like what is being offered. So I can talk about that too, if that's helpful.
Yeah, that sounds good because I think, without understanding what companies are doing, it could be easy to think that employees are just like, well, they're not doing it. We hear a lot, especially in the wellness space, because people don't often prioritize it the way that we know they should based on the research. It's like, oh, people are just complaining for no reason. But in this instance, I feel like it could be really interesting to hear like, okay, well, they're saying that they're feeling one way because of, like your quote said, overwork and things of that nature. So what are companies doing to address it? I'm curious because we might see some misalignment between some of what that quote represented and what they said was representative of the data and what companies are putting in place.
Yeah, so totally agree with you. And I think that what they found is that overall people are not providing that much. Like employers are not providing that much. And we've talked about this, like there's wellness programs. Some companies will have quote wellness programs, but it might just be like, here's a discount on like gyms or whatever. And that's not really a holistic program. This goes even more basic. Only 43% of the employers that, the employees reported having a health insurance coverage for mental health and substance abuse issues.
Wow. That's
43%. That's so low.
Yeah, that is.
So low.
Yeah, especially when you have, for employees to report that they're experiencing burnout, honestly, people think that people are like whiners and complainers and whatever. They're really not. People are unlikely to name their condition as something. Like more people are more likely to be like, well, I'm feeling a little tired lately. I'm feeling a little overwhelmed, but I wouldn't call it burnout, right? And so I feel like it's interesting that and not good, that less than half the companies are offering these sorts of services, but more than half of the people said they're experiencing were willing to like name and report what they experience as burnout.
Well, and actually, they weren't even asked about burnout specifically. They're asked if they experience emotional exhaustion. Are they feeling, ineffective? Are they feeling less motivated? Things like that. So they actually asked more about the symptom level, which to me feels like it's probably more accurate than asking about burnout specifically. But that means still, that's a huge number of people. 57% of people saying that they have some sort of workplace burnout type symptoms. Like that's a lot of people, and like you said, is misaligned with the number of people that are getting mental health support in their health insurance. And mental health help can cost a lot of money, and so if your coverage doesn't cover that, like that's wild.
Yeah, absolutely. Oh, totally. And I agree that it's cool and interesting that they ask them at the symptom level, because that's more like, and not to get too into the weeds of how our research works for the listeners, but just so people listening can understand a little bit. Usually when we assess something, we don't ask people like, are you burnout or not? We ask them multiple items that get at different facets of burnout that helps us to understand on average what they're experiencing, how much they're experiencing. So it sounds like they used a little bit more of that approach maybe.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they did. I mean, ultimately this is the APA that did this poll. So
yes,
I think that they used pretty good practices here.
True.
I guess, those other psychologists also know what they're doing.
Yeah, true.
But yeah, so that was a big one. The other thing is another program people point to a lot as like, well, we do support mental health. We have an EAP, an employee assistance program. Well, only 29% reported having that.
Wow.
Part of me wonders a little bit if there's maybe some lack of knowledge of it because they're not communicated very well within organizations. But either way, only 29% of people feel like it exists at all. So whether it does exist or doesn't exist, but they aren't aware of it, is a different, I'm not sure. But that's really low. Really
it
low.
is. And also, I mean, if it exists but you're not aware of it, it's like you said, like that's a little bit better, I guess, than not existing at all. But if it exists and people don't know about it, then there may be either something about the culture that's not supporting people discussing that, the availability of that, or there could be just like poor communication about benefits, which isn't helpful. So something else broken in that system for sure.
Yeah, and ultimately, if you don't know it exists, it basically doesn't exist, right? Like,
right. Yes.
You can't access it.
Totally.
So 29% report that they have it, which is nothing.
Yeah.
The other things they looked at are like specific, what's the word I'm looking for? Specific cultural components, or like less programmatic, but more like things that they do within the company, like practices that can help with things like mental health. So they did look at a few different things there. And so those are super interesting. So I'm just going to read them all off and we can talk about it. But it was only 35% said that their employer offers a culture where breaks are encouraged. Only 21% report that they offer meeting-free days. Only 17% report that they offer 4-day work weeks. Only 15% report that there are company-wide mental health days. And only 12% say that people on site have received any mental health training to, suss out a crisis if one is occurring.
Yeah, that's really interesting because those feel like practices that people introduced as more like, it feels like those should have been more mainstreamed by now. Like we remember a time a few years ago when those things were newly introduced to the workplace, and there's research that supports that people are just as productive in a 4-day work week as a 5-day work week. And there's research that supports, these other trends that you had mentioned in the data that used to be these like new eye-opening things. And now it feels like, okay, these things have been around for a little while. And I guess the data is suggesting that they haven't been mainstreamed.
Yeah, pretty much. Like they're suggesting that people are just not doing it, right? There's just not a lot of it. And like even the culture one, like that's that's not the same thing as doing a 40 work week. That's not the same
Right.
thing as saying like everybody gets a mental health day today and so no
Right.
one works
Yep.
today.
Yep.
Like that is just saying like you can get up from your desk and take a break. Like
Right.
only 35% of people say that that's what happens in their
Yeah.
workplace. Like that's
Right.
that's way lower than I would have
Yeah,
guessed.
because that's not like a new thing. I mean, being able to take breaks is not something that should be a luxury. Being encouraged to take breaks. I mean, and I guess I could see like if someone asks, are you encouraged to take breaks? Like, do they let you take your required breaks for like hourly workers? Like, I'm sure they do, but for folks that don't have scheduled breaks, I could imagine, yeah, like based on what I've, experienced and what I've heard from other friends working, I can imagine that people feel like they're not encouraged to take breaks. Like it's hard to even find time to like pee in the middle of the day in between
Yeah.
Zoom meetings. You know what I mean? So it's not good, but I guess if I really think about the encouragement piece, it's like, yeah, I don't know that people are being encouraged.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like when I really think about it, I'm like, oh, that makes sense, especially for non-hourly. Like you're saying, there is some mandated breaks, and so hopefully for hourly workers, those are at least existing. But for everybody else that is salaried and they're kind of the way they work is a little bit different. I could totally see that. I mean, how many times, and the behavior is not modeled either. Like I can tell you how many times I've been in calls with leaders across a variety of organizations, and they're all eating their lunch on a call.
Yeah.
And I've done it. I've done that so many times.
Yeah.
I've been in a team meeting with my team, and I'll be like, "Sorry, I have to eat my lunch really quick," and then I'm modeling the same bad behavior,
Right.
to all of them, and so then it just becomes this like norm that you just sit and eat your lunch in a meeting, and that's like the
Right.
one meeting you get to turn your camera off for, like
Yeah.
it's just
Totally.
it's like creating this like environment where people are feeling that they can't walk away, they can't step away, and with Zoom and Slack and all these things where you're pinging people all the time too, that like even if they do walk away to go get their lunch, they still are getting messages and are likely expected to respond to those messages as timely as possible. So then
Yeah.
now even their break when they're not sitting at the desk is still something they're probably not fully disconnecting from.
Yeah. And also, I think, especially in virtual work where people will just like grab time on your calendar and not think that you need transition time between meetings, which I think is a little bit of a difference. Like people at least before recognize that if you had to like leave a meeting and walk down for a meeting, you're probably going to be a few minutes late getting there. If you like stop at the bathroom on the way in the office, it's like they're like, oh, she's in the bathroom, she'll be there in a minute, whatever. But at home, and you're, just having to pop into a Zoom, even though you could totally do that and, send a quick message saying, I'm going to be a few minutes late, I just had to like take a bio break or whatever. People don't really do it or don't seem to feel as comfortable doing it. So you're like in thing after thing after thing, and it can get really stressful. So I think that's maybe why people are saying it's not encouraged, because it's like there's this norm of just stack all your meetings one after another and figure out when you'll take care of any other needs in between if you ever get to them. So that's interesting, although sad.
So
So do they have like recommendations for what organizations should do based on what they learned at all?
They don't really. I mean, like I said, they did frame a lot of the findings in the 5 workplace essentials. So that's kind of like the overview. I mean, like I said, this is a long report with a lot of stats that we can talk about.
Yeah.
So we're not going to do all of it. But when we look at the 5 workplace essentials, they talk about like how many people are saying that they're in a toxic work environment. And then they break it down by like industry. And then, so like there's some like details around like where are places where maybe you want to focus on.
Sure.
And then they also had like sidebars where it'd be like, actually Tammy Allen was featured in one of them. So one of our fellow IOs.
Yeah.
Like they put a couple things on the side. It's like, here's a tip from something that Tammy Allen once said. And so they give a couple things on the side
Yeah.
bar that can guide you in the right direction, but there's not a ton. So
Yeah.
I think kind of the work that we've done in terms of bringing that research to light is kind of a good complement to this type of a report.
Gotcha. That makes a lot of sense. And I think, just understanding the scope of a problem can be a good first step for solving it. So there's a lot of value in understanding what's going on and what the gaps are. And also for people, I mean, I think this is a really useful tool, and I'm glad that you pointed to this report because I also think it's really, really helpful for people to be able to bring reports like this to their employers, because it's not just like, oh, look, like we're just this like whining, complaining group of people that's unlike other employees in other places. And I think, sometimes leaders think that employees are blowing things out of proportion or they need more data. And so in this instance, I think that they, employees can bring this to their employer to show like, hey, it's not just us. And also there is this discrepancy. And we should probably start brainstorming about ways to solve it.
Agreed. 100% agreed. I think it is super important to have this kind of information. I'm going to end us on a note where I'm going to give 2 stats that are sad and 1 stat that is good. So that's how we're going to end. So at least there's going to be on a somewhat positive note.
Yes. I'll take it.
Okay. So the work-life harmony section I thought was interesting because it's kind of like talking about things that we talk about a lot, like boundaries, etc. Mm-hmm. So they have a stat in here that 26% of employees think that they do not get respect for their personal boundaries at work. So that's not massive. There's a lot of people that say they don't feel like they have flexibility, things like that. But 26% basically are like, my employer does not respect my boundaries at all.
That's interesting.
Which is sad.
Yeah, it is sad.
Yeah. And then there's additional stats around how like less than 40% say that their time off is respected. So that means 60% of employees don't feel like their time off is respected. So stuff like that is going on. There's this other. Sorry, go ahead.
No, I was just gonna say, it feels like even though you're saying it's not the majority, it's still like, wow, if you think about that chunk of the workforce and how many like millions of people that represents, that's a lot.
Exactly. Which leads to my second sad stat, which is 29% of workers felt like they don't matter to their employer.
Oh, that's sad.
I know. It was so sad.
You do matter. If you took the survey and you're listening, you matter to us.
You matter. I know.
But that is a shame. I mean, that's like a terrible feeling, right? To be like, no one cares. That's horrible.
I know. It's really sad. But then the positive thing is 74% of employees feel like they're satisfied with the growth and development they get at work. So that's really cool.
That is cool. So I guess that's kind of interesting. So I guess, I wonder if when people are answering those questions and they're thinking about whether or not they matter to their employer, I wonder if they're thinking about like mattering to the company. But when they're thinking about growth and development, it's really about the individual relationships that they've made with their managers that are helping to create that like silver lining that they feel like they're able to develop and grow because of more proximal relationships that they have, as opposed to like, do I matter to the organization? Like, no, I don't think I think the organization would, could replace me and wouldn't cry about it. But maybe the other piece of it is more about what their manager or people close to them are coaching them or allowing them to do.
Yeah, I think you're probably right. I think there's definitely a component there that's likely related to the manager themselves versus the broader employer. Their company feels like they matter, right? Because maybe the manager, if they ask, do you matter to your manager, they might answer differently.
Yep.
So I think there's that. And then like some of the development questions are kind of around like, do they have opportunities to be like creative in their work? Do they feel like there's a chance to reach their potential? So there are some questions in here that I think are a slightly different bend. So I could see how they might be responding a little bit differently to these. But regardless, I think that there is a positive. So when you're thinking about, if you're an employer, if you're a leader listening to this, like there's a lot of room for opportunity of growth, right? For the employer to do better around well-being. But it sounds like at least, you know what? Most people are doing okay with development. So let's keep that going. Let's not lose that. People want to feel like they're growing. They want to feel like they can advance. So let's continue to provide trainings and opportunities for that as we work on these other areas where we can hopefully make employees feel like they matter, give them some less stress, all of those things that are super important.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. So there is a bright spot. And maybe if you're a manager and you're listening to this and you're in an organization where you feel like these boundaries are not respected at upper levels and, people aren't made to feel valued, maybe think about what is in your scope to shift that conversation as well.
Exactly. Well, I'm glad that we walked through this today. I thought it was important. I will have a link, of course, in the show notes. So if somebody wants to dive into the other stats, it's all there for you.
Yeah, that's awesome. I appreciate you bringing this up, and it's really important. It's a big data set coming from the largest authority on psychology in America. So I think that is really, really useful.
Cool. Well, thank you all for listening. Hopefully you all found it helpful as well. As I mentioned, show notes will have all the details for you. And then in addition, if you want to learn more about us or about our community, you can find all of that on our website. And we'd encourage you to check us out on LinkedIn as we continue to share content there all the time for all of you listeners. Thanks for listening. Thriving at Work is hosted by us, Dr. Patricia Grabarek and Dr. Katina Sawyer, and produced by Allie Johnson.